distinguished guests and friends, welcome to the first session at NYU New York of the International Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy. My appreciation is expressed to Blair Simmons and the entire staff of the LaGuardia Coupe for hosting these sessions. This location is a student-oriented, learning futures, and data analysis-driven facility aimed at promoting NYU as a global network university in its outreach to the world. We come together as the 72nd regular session of the United Nations General Assembly occurs. Sadly, violence against civilians is an omnipresent global reality. The imperative to strengthen cultural diplomacy, defined as the exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples in order to foster mutual understanding, invites the university to enhance its role in the public service. The essential question in learning, in research, and in service within the university setting asks, if area experts and international researchers are only collecting data and no subsequent action is taken on the basis of the evidence discovered, is justice being served? This query resonates most strongly in our present time, where the imperative is to grapple with the security, development, justice nexus, to understand the plight of the most disenfranchised in our world. The concerns of the university in the public service are on the vulnerabilities of increasing numbers of underserved peoples that define our human condition. The reality of complex interdependence deepens our mutual fragility. We bear witness through crowdsourced maps and visual data to the stories of women and girls who suffer from physical abuses in public spaces, and to the plight of the marginalized, who are targeted in ethno-national, religious, linguistic conflicts, which result in mass atrocities and genocidal violence. The genuine harm that can be inflicted on already vulnerable populations as a result of technological interventions in remote and fragile locales requires us to bear in mind the golden rule. And that golden rule is do no harm. We strive, in the words of President Elizabeth Guigou, to move from, and I quote, awareness to results in our efforts to counter exclusion and to protect the most vulnerable. In cultural diplomacy as a vocation, we underline freedom from exclusion as a human right, as I wrote years ago in a keynote for the United Nations Chronicle. In this context, researchers and practitioners alike must always return to the impact of their engagement with technologies in the local area, which has a robust cultural specificity across countries. Democratic Republic of Congo, Guatemala, Bosnia, Libya, North Korea, Syria, and Nigeria, to cite just a few examples. This emphasis is in line with the area studies literature that rejects the disappearing local in the 21st century globalization context. Instead, localization outreach is a theme that figures prominently in the university's engagement, which speaks in the language of cultural diplomacy to the ideas expressed by Eleanor Roosevelt, as she asked, where, after all, do human universal rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. Mrs. Roosevelt's quest was to give voice to the powerless. This quest guides the university engagement in the public service to revolutionize, to professionalize, to disrupt the field of data collection. The careful delineation of the manner in which an emerging community of research and practice works to intervene or not to intervene with technologies at different stages of public abuses or mass atrocities is at the forefront of our concerns in pedagogy as well as policy. Violence against civilians targets women and girls with a particular consistency around the world. For this reason, NYU New York is forging cooperation with Safe City to support crowd mapping, reports by women in India and other countries of abuses they suffer in public spaces. The university engagement to empathize with the stories that are shared by women and girls underlines a well-known Irish quote mentioned by President Mary Robinson at a security and development meeting yesterday, in which climate justice was underscored. If you have the words, there's always a chance that you'll find the way. That, of course, from Seamus Heaney. The university's vocation is to place education in the service of a society that gives the marginalized hope. A society in which servant leaders speak to its civil nature and who act to ensure that learning today inspires and anticipates future human needs in action-oriented service. These are the leaders inspired by the commitment of Her Excellency Dr. Joyce Banda, who urge world citizens to act together in the service of education. Cultural diplomacy must continue to play a vital role in these efforts to serve our common humanity. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions and to engage in a dialogue with you, which I think is much more important than actually simply speaking to an audience. But I wanted to share with you some of my ideas and some of the engagement that NYU New York is taking on behalf of the ethics of data collection, engaged with different partners around the world, like Safe City, like Physicians for Human Rights, like Amnesty International, the research that we are undertaking, with a purpose always to learn together, to research in community, and above all, to serve our common humanity. So thank you very much, first and foremost, for joining us here today, for taking the time to join us here today, and also for sharing with me your ideas, what you've come here to experience, what you want to learn, what you want to contribute from your local areas. I'm most curious to hear from each and every one of you. So please, by all means, let's start an interactive dialogue. Who would like to open our discussion? Please.
No one.
Please.
Excuse me, Professor, I want to ask.
Yeah.
Please.
In your deliberations, you mostly mention about the so-called third world countries highlighting their issues. What is the position or the nature of the issues in the Western world, especially in America, like when we talk about the violence against women, the religious extremism, and these kind of things? Would you like to give some light on that, please?
Indeed, I think it's a challenge that we face in common. It's a challenge that the developed world faces in different ways, but it's a challenge for us because countering violent extremism is a challenge for the planet in the present era. The marginalized, those who feel that their human needs are being neglected, those who are frustrated in their aspirations, in learning, in employment, they face the challenge of integrating into our society. And I think it is the marginalization and the lack of integration in the Western world as well, in the United States and in European countries, that poses a challenge and a threat to us, given that the danger is from within. It is not only from without, but it is from within. So therefore, I would underline integration as our common challenge and our global concern. The integration of those who feel left off the radar, the integration of those who feel that their contributions to society are overlooked, those who feel, again, disenfranchised, who do not believe that their contributions are recognized. As Madame Guigou underlined yesterday, we must move from awareness to results. NYU as a university is focused on results. We use our learning, our research, and our service to engage in common projects with others around the world in a results-oriented, service-focused orientation. Other questions or comments, please? Yes?
Yes. So, Veronica Sabag, you're mentioning the fact that precisely now that the university is engaging in projects, would you have any priority areas in which you would like to engage? And more precisely, do you have any project on the promotion, for example, of the culture of peace? And how do you understand peace, and where and how do you think that cultural diplomacy could serve this purpose?
I understand peace very much in the sense of positive peace. And I think that more than simply dismantling barriers, we have to go much further and encourage, nurture, and sustain justice. And to do that, I believe that we can work in a number of different ways. Yesterday I was at a security and development meeting of the Club de Madrid. And each of the leaders there emphasized, whether it was climate justice or whether it was education, the opportunities for the youth. And indeed, there were many youth leaders who were present in attendance. I was inspired by their motivation. I was inspired by their engagement. One young woman from the Philippines is working on making libraries available so that those who don't have access can go and find books to read and be inspired by the knowledge that they not only are gaining, but they are creating. So I think it's these types of initiatives, very much with a focus on the grassroots, with a focus on the local. Again, my emphasis on localization outreach. We want to work from the inside out. So the orientation of our projects is very much from the local upward. We're not really as much interested in these top-down imposed types of solutions, which I believe are limited in their ability to comprehend the human needs of those in local areas. So when I say we are working with Safe City, this is an entity which started in India, which is now involved in Nepal, in Kenya, is moving really towards other countries in Africa and Latin America. And again, public violence, public abuse against women is a common challenge that we face. Sharing our stories is necessary. And through reporting, through sharing of stories, through analysis of crowd-mapped data, we hope to have a better awareness and understanding of the actions that can be taken to mitigate and to prevent this type of abuse. That's one area where I would say NYU does seek to engage. We have a data services studio. Him Mistry, our manager, is of Indian origin. And we are forging these, what I would say, local university connections in the service of this university as a global network university. NYU has been defined that way by the former president, John Sexton. Therefore, as educators, it is up to us to decide how we want to teach, how we want to research, how we want to serve in this particular university context. And because the imperative, I think, is to acknowledge that culture brings with it the specificity of local areas. Culture must be at the forefront of our reflections as we engage. And that's why I am delighted that the Symposium for Cultural Diplomacy has chosen NYU as one of the venues this year for its sessions. And we are indeed proud and delighted to welcome you here. Thank you. Other questions or comments? I welcome to hear your comments either from other sessions that you plan to participate in or experiences that you bring with you as you're coming here. for this, I believe, 10th symposium. Is that correct? Are we in the 10th symposium now? Okay. I believe that's what I was reading.
I'm interested in the methods of data collection and if students are in the field and are working at the local level and how that transpires and the trajectory of collecting data, working with the local people, and where does that data go and how is this very result-driven enterprise enacted?
That's an essential question, and I thank you for asking it. We recently published a special issue of the International Journal Genocide Studies and Prevention. And this was the culmination of a 3-year effort in cooperation with our partners at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, the University of Oslo, and then Amnesty International and Physicians for Human Rights, George Mason University, a number of other partners in Afghanistan and other countries. And these partners are very engaged in the local areas. They are also somewhat careful, cautious, in deciding when and whether to deploy technology. So my goal is to foster a pedagogy where we bring in the best practices and the experiences of those in the field to inspire students who would like to undertake this type of research. Because I think we're really at the beginning of what is becoming increasingly necessary in research, and that is to engage in the field in ethically sensitive ways, because the data that we are collecting is often very sensitive data. If you're collecting data from vulnerable populations who are in the midst of conflict, who've been, sexually abused, then your priority to do no harm is to make sure that that data is collected carefully, that it's protected, that those who are submitting the data don't in turn become targets. And that's what we're writing about. And that's where we pause and we think very carefully about whether we engage or whether we don't engage.
And the policies of the government, and that's the tricky part.
That's intricate because sometimes a government might not believe in a shared community, might not believe in what we aspire to achieve, and that is an open, fruitful exchange of knowledge, a creation of knowledge, and really to seek to tell the stories in a way that either creates a narrative or challenges an existing narrative. And I think that's really, in a sense, when the state is partisan, as you know, challenging an existing narrative is a very difficult thing to do. I myself was in Guatemala and I saw this firsthand. It's a great challenge for researchers, for educators, to go into these local areas in the midst of what is essentially local populations. In that case, it was local Guatemalan families, aspiring to tell their story, aspiring to find their loved ones who disappeared. It's sensitive, but it's necessary. And my goal in the Classroom Without Borders, as I call it, is to encourage students to undertake that type of endeavor and to make that part of their learning during their undergraduate and graduate studies. So we have a lot of work to do in this area. I think understanding of different cultures is at the forefront of that work. And we're encouraging now the beginnings of a second issue, where we're going to bring in other researchers and other practitioners to continue to build on what we accomplished in the first special issue. So that is presently what we are starting to organize. Thank you for the question. Other questions or comments? Please.
Hi, Colette.
Hi.
My name is Kathleen Smith. I'm a school administrator in Newark, New Jersey.
Hello.
We have a vocational high school. We just started a program with law, diplomacy, and international relations. So I guess my question for you would be, what recommendations would you make for starting a local diplomacy program at the high school level?
Well, first, I think that's an excellent level to start at. I remember Jean Monnet in his memoir said about the integration in Europe. If I were to start, I would start with culture. I think it's very, very important, particularly for the millennial generation, that there is this emphasis on culture. The millennial generation is very much the mobile phone generation. And my concern about the mobile phone, quite honestly, is that that's a somewhat closed environment. And it's a filtered environment. So information is filtered, and what young people receive is filtered. So that gives them perhaps one aspect of a reality. What I think an emphasis on cultural diplomacy does is it opens that environment up. It encourages intellectual curiosity. It makes people want to really learn about the other, to think about how do I define my other, as Kapuscinski would say in his famous book. And I think at the high school level, this is precisely the time when students can be engaging, when they can be having discussions with others face to face, and where technology can be put in its proper place. I think, cultural exchange, what former Senator Fulbright had in mind, I think that's an imperative in today's world, and cultural diplomacy is an imperative in today's world. And it's imperative because if the generations are to understand each other, they have to have a common reference point. And I think that common reference point can and should be culture. The millennial generation is growing up without any knowledge of the analog experience. And I think what your initiative could do is give them very much a sense of where they can belong within our world and balance that use of the mobile with exchanges of ideas and experiences that can inspire them and can enrich their understanding and our mutual understanding of the world in which we live, of the challenges that we face, of our common vulnerabilities, and of the fact that as we become more interconnected, we are collectively more fragile. And I think that cultural diplomacy at the service, in education, is one way of our coming to that mutual understanding. Please. Other thoughts, ideas?
Actually,
Please.
I just want to comment on what you said, that the millennium generation may be somehow, close into what they access to, the information they get. But at the same time, maybe I'm optimistic, but this is precisely the chance that we have today to try to define and shape a global culture. Because, when we were raised in a baby, we were used to be in our neighborhoods, in our countries, but we didn't have this sense of what was going on somewhere else.
Yes.
And here, because of the technology, because of this connected world, we have the chance to see that. But the piece that is lacking, and I agree with you, is this cultural, this global culture. So, personally, but this is my personal opinion, I do see a chance there to develop these precisely. Common grounds, as you said, where, and personally, my reflection starts by peace, by defining what is the culture of peace, what is the tolerance, the diversity, the rights of someone else. So those are, for me, the basics, but this is the way I approach this cultural diplomacy. But, this is what I wanted to say.
No, and I think that there is that hope. I guess what I would say is, for me, it depends on what we define as we. So in other words, how many we can bring into the world of which you speak, where technology is at the service of, not a replacement for, exchanges that underline this culture of peace. Who is on the grid? Who is included? When I wrote about freedom from exclusion as a human right, and this is really going back now 15 years, right? I was already concerned with the question of those who would be included, and more importantly, those who were excluded. And I think with globalization, the communications revolution that dates back to the 90s, the concern is how far can we push that envelope in our mutual learning, in how we utilize technologies. If we can utilize them to include, to enfranchise, to empower, always with a focus on service learning, then I think, yes, there is that hope. But in the globalization era, what I think we bear witness to is increasing fragmentation, and that fragmentation is part of, I think, a backlash. Those who feel left out those who feel their contributions are not respected. That's the danger that I see. And it doesn't have to cancel out your hope, not by any stretch of the imagination, but I think imagination is what is required. There cannot be a box. We have to think without a box creatively together about how our use of mobile technologies in particular, because that's where most of the developing world is going, how our use of those technologies can foster inclusion. And how we can go from awareness to results, as Madame Yugli said yesterday, in thinking about countering exclusion. That's, I think, the challenge that we face together. And I think the more dialogue we can have about that challenge, the more likely we are to realize your hope. And my, shall we say, aspiration would be to realize that hope. So I do agree with you. I just put out there my concerns from what I've seen traveling and speaking with different colleagues and different students. Other thoughts, ideas, questions? Where were you this morning, just out of curiosity? What did you do this morning?
Shabbat Jewish Center.
And what happened there exactly? What was the dialogue about?
Yeah, we started off with the role of religious leaders
Uh-huh.
in curbing the extremism, and then we spoke about the role of education in curbing the extremism, and then something about the need and importance of interfaith dialogue.
Uh-huh. And what came out of your exchanges in that session? What were some of the takeaways?
Importance of education.
The importance of education in what respect exactly? So primary school education, high school education, all levels of education? All levels.
And especially from my side, also we need to differentiate what is, what maybe we are calling education is also propaganda.
Please, could you say more about that?
Well, I am a journalist and an advertiser, you know, I am not a non-believer person, you know. I grew up, for example, in a religious environment, like in Barcelona, Spain.
Yes.
I grew up in a Catholic school, so that helped me maybe to criticize even more, because in order to criticize, you need to know what is everything about. I mean, it's difficult, it's impossible to criticize something if you don't know it.
Indeed.
If you never got in touch with it, and so on. So, for example, on myself, I criticize deeply Catholic religion, is because I was inside in somehow for several years, maybe almost for 15 years. And so, and I discovered, and after going to university, even public university, and I did it partially public and private, because
Yes.
in Spain, you know, they have public and private, and it's better considered the public one, because you need the grades not to pay for it in order to have access. I mean, and this is the hard thing, you know. And the thing that I realized that I think at the end of the university, of course you learn, but I had the impression that you don't learn anything at all. I mean, because it's one of the main killers. Education and higher education is one of the main killers, and maybe that's why I'm an advertiser in public relations. Is one of the main killers of creativity.
I'm sorry?
Creativity.
Did you say
Yeah,
credibility?
independence. You know,
Oh, creativity.
independence,
Okay.
brain independence, especially brain independence. And at the end, you discover the university, what it's doing for you is not teaching at all. Of course, it does. You know, we have to interpret a little bit of that. But it fits you for the market level in the future.
I understand what you're saying, but you see, I would have a different impression of that on the basis of what I believe is important in learning. And that is this independence of thinking, this critical thinking, this questioning of strictly Western ideas about international relations, this going into the field, a more organic sense of learning.
Well, one of my professors at the university, I remember this, once, because, for example, We have now in Catalonia a very strange independent process that, by the way, today one of the ministers
Yeah.
has been arrested
Uh-huh.
by the police. So we are having again, like we are talking about the World War II period, we are having again, like in the Civil War with Franco,
Yes.
we are having again, political prisoners, again,
Yes. Mhm.
in democracy, or so-called democracy.
Yes.
We have to discover the danger. So once we had a discussion about this topic, and I said, well, I am not a patriotic. And he replied me, I was impressed, I was in silence when he replied me, no, you are patriotic. And I say, why? Because you are questioning all the time. And there is no biggest thing to question everything. There is no more patriotic than questioning all the time and not accepting the first, answer that the people are giving at the first one.
But you see, I think this critical inquiry is at the heart of learning, and this is why we emphasize so much this idea that one must go into the field and one must question for oneself what one experiences there. It's not enough simply to sit in the classroom and read a book. You have to be willing to engage. You have to be willing to put yourself out there. And part of the learning today, I think, is both a practical experience that comes from the combination of what you study and what you do, and how you do it.
Yeah.
And in that respect, I think learning can be a catalyst for creativity. I don't think it. I understand what you're saying, that it can kill creativity. I do understand what you're saying. However, I think it's incumbent on the educator to define what the learning process is, and to design pedagogies that really instill that intellectual curiosity and that motivation to be engaged and to want to learn more and to want to question more. So I appreciate your comments, because I think it comes to the heart of what our responsibilities are in learning in the 21st century, to create these learning futures and to innovate. So I take your comments as a challenge to be more creative and to be more critical. And I thank you for the observation. Please.
So if we could please express our gratitude once again to Professor Colette for excellent presentation.
My pleasure.